As you all know, RMS Britannic is a ship that never existed, at least in a completed form. The hull and superstructure was built, the interiors were planned, and in some cases already furnished and ready for installation. But it's well known that the ship was never used for its intended purpose, that being transporting passengers across the North Atlantic Ocean in unrivaled luxury. Instead, its still incomplete body was transformed into His Majesty's hospital ship Britannic. Unfortunately, this was when the story would end. Now, over 100 years later, the only evidence we have of RMS Britannic is through documents and illustrations. Many people have taken the time to stitch the remaining documents together to make a complete picture, but in most cases, you kinda have to take it into your own hands. There's only so much documentation we have of the proposed ship, so a lot of it is educated guesses. How so, you may ask? Well, it's complicated, but not too complicated, at least for me, given that I've studied RMS Britannic state even more so than her HMHS state, and I think I'm very well qualified for this job. What would have RMS Britannic been like? Let's find out. Let's talk promenade space, and newsflash, just like her sisters, the available promenade spaces have been heavily altered. The first thing of note when taking a look at deck plans and illustrations are these massive davits littered about the ship's boat deck and poop deck. This is something you can't find on her sisters. They were added to the design during the ship's early construction phase, which perfectly coincides with the Titanic disaster in April of 1912. A common belief at the time for the cause of the great loss of life were the insufficient lifeboats, 20 to be exact and about 28 shorter than what was needed. I'm not going to go into the specifics as I have done in the past, but in short, White Star Line needed a solution for their next Olympian. Later that year, Olympic would be brought back to her builders Harlan Wolff, and during this time, a major overhaul would take place, which bled into early 1913. This overhaul would be extensive, as workers descended to the depths of the ship, adding an extra layer of skin along the ship's sides and raising 17 of her watertight bulkheads, some all the way up to B-deck. In the end, almost every design oversight possible was fixed and improved upon with this overhaul. Olympic even received some of Titanic's new and improved interior spaces, but not all. That's the thing. While this overhaul was enough to restore faith in the Olympic class, there was only so much her builders could do with an already complete ship. You can teach an old dog new tricks, but its old ways will always shine through in the end. With Britannic, however, the ship was only ribs at this point, so making, in some cases, complete redesigns was possible. I'll touch on this more later on, but for now, let's go back to lifeboat davits. On Olympic, the understock of lifeboats was a relatively easy fix. Her well and davits had originally been designed to carry 2 stacked lifeboats per davit set, meaning that the ship could already add an extra 14 full-size lifeboats with its original davit layout. The ship needed 48 lifeboats though. To solve this, her boat deck bulwarks were cut away and additional sets of well and davits were installed. It was a simple fix that got the job done, but because of this, it became impractical for first and second class passengers. The 48 stacked lifeboats cluttered much of the deck, and it overall just wasn't as appealing as their once open and free promenade space. Because of this, William Edward Armstrong was assigned the role of coming up with a better configuration for Britannic. He took this opportunity to design something unheard of in the realm of shipbuilding. Traditional lifeboat davits were small, and could only accommodate 1 or 2 boats per set. Armstrong, however, designed large mechanical davits that could accommodate 5 or even 6 boats per set. The boats themselves were stacked in 2 to 3 rows, with 1 to 3 boats per stack depending on their location. The gantry davits themselves were placed smack dab in the middle of where passengers would usually walk, which kinda defeats the purpose of their conception in the first place, but it's not as much of a problem as you might think given the improvements in size made to the first, second, and third class promenades. Don't worry, I'm about to get to that. Anyway, this new type of lifeboat davit was extremely innovative for the time. The fact that they were mechanically driven with motors meant that in the event of an emergency, they would have been much faster and much more efficient than the traditional man-powered davits. Okay, With that out of the way, let's move back to promenade spaces. Starting with first class, not much has changed coming from her sisters. One thing to note though is the sort of hybrid between Olympic and Titanic's promenade configurations. First class boat deck promenade spaces remain completely unchanged, besides the addition of the children's playroom taking up what was originally a blank cutout on her sisters. The A deck promenade also remains unchanged, in this case taking inspiration from Titanic's promenade configuration, with the forward half being enclosed and the aft half being open to the elements. Something that is notably different from Titanic is the returning B-deck promenade from Olympic. Well, kinda. Most of the additional spaces added on Titanic are still present up to the parlor suites, but past this, I'm not sure why the decision was made to add back a good 40% of the B-deck promenade, but at least it was added in the best possible place, starting at the forward end of B-deck and ending at the entrance to the main grand staircase. It becomes a lot more interesting though once we take a look at what was changed to the second and third class promenades, but that's something I'll be tackling in part 2 and 3. For now, let's move on. This is where it gets interesting. There's a lot, and I mean a lot of things to cover, and I simply can't cover everything because not everything about RMS Britannic's interior spaces is known. This means that a sizable portion of the areas I cover will be based off of educated guesses from how the spaces were on her sisters, as well as how the known spaces were altered. Let's begin with rooms we actually have documentation of. Perhaps one of the most famous spaces on the Olympic class was the grand staircase. What an absolute design marvel. In the timeless style of William and Mary, carved Irish oak decorated the walls, support columns, as well as the railing banisters and newel posts. The banisters themselves were likewise decorated with wrought iron grills, ornamented in Louis XIV style. The cream-colored tiles were made from linoleum, with black medallion floor tiles placed orderly. Topping all of this, literally, was a glass and iron dome with a crystal chandelier in the center. Easily the most iconic part of the room, though, was the clock, crowned in the famous Honor and Glory art piece. Olympic and Titanic's configurations of this room were basically identical. However, by the time of Britannic's construction in 1914, this style was starting to fall out of style. Britannic's configuration of this famous room wasn't actually changed all that much, besides 3 major alterations. By the early 20th century, giant player organs had become a symbol of immense wealth. Olympic originally was supposed to be fitted with an organ, however, the instruments were not ready for public use in time for the ship's main voyage. Britannic, on the other hand, for sure would have had an organ fitted in the main grand staircase lobby, as confirmed by deck plans and documentation of the order. The organ itself would have been out of sight, the only evidence of its existence being an added wall extrusion opposite of the staircase, with carved screens for sound to escape. The floor was also changed, the alterations being a different style that was far more elaborate. The third alteration was one that was originally planned for Olympic, but scrapped for time. The 3 main elevators just behind the main grand staircase only went up to A deck on Olympic and Titanic, with the elevator gears located just behind the boat deck grand staircase lobby. Britannic's elevator gears, on the other hand, were moved atop the boat deck superstructure, with a new structure being built around them. This meant that the elevators could reach all the way to the boat deck grand staircase lobby. This prompted a redesign of the area that implemented the elevators into the boat deck grand staircase lobby, which, in the end, made even more sense than the original configuration on Olympic and Titanic. On the topic of the boat deck grand staircase lobby, there were 2 public spaces that could be accessed from it. The gymnasium, which probably would have been unaltered on Britannic, but also the children's playroom. This was a completely new space added for Britannic, which would have serviced first-class only children with entertainment. Not much is known about the space itself besides its purpose, so I'll move on. The layout of Britannic's A-deck would have been practically unchanged from her sisters, but there are still some notable changes. In the A-deck grand staircase lobby looking aft, there would have been a revolving door to the left. Entering through this door would have revealed a long corridor. This corridor would have led to the first-class reading and writing room, through an entrance to the right of the entrance to the first-class lounge. The reading and writing room was a rather small public space, meant to be a sort of branch of the lounge. Decorated in Gregorian style, is primarily used for the ladies, however men were allowed in the space. Its purpose was similar to the lounge, in that it was a space for relaxing, reading, and writing letters to the mainland. Because of this, however, it was almost never occupied by passengers regularly. This was noted by Thomas Andrews and Bruce Ismay during Olympic and Titanic's main voyage. During Titanic's main voyage, Enders made plans for a reduction in size to the space, making more room for cabins. This design alteration was implemented on Olympic during the ship's 1913 refit, and the same was planned for Britannic. Besides this though, there is no evidence that the space would have been altered beyond this. The first-class lounge is another very luxurious and ornately decorated public space on the Olympic class. Decorated in Louis XV style, carved English oak paneling was primarily used. The space was furnished with many intricately placed tables, armchairs, and sofas, all of which decorated with cushioned green and gold floral patterns. Partition walls broke up the sitting areas into sections. The lounge housed a gray marble fireplace heated with an electric heater. Above the fireplace was a massive mirror. Opposite to the fireplace was a moderately sized bookcase filled to the brim with freshly stocked books. The centerpiece of the room was a large, ornate, electrically lit chandelier. The ceiling stood at a height of about 12 feet. Because of this, the ceiling stuck out a few feet above the boat deck. The lounge was widely used before and after dinner for relaxing, ordering refreshments, reading books, and playing cards. Just like the reading and writing room, it was primarily for ladies, but was also popular with the gentlemen. The overall design and layout of the room would have remained the same on Britannic. However, several small rectangular skylights would have been added to allow more natural light to come in. To the right, looking aft, would have been another revolving door, which led to another long corridor. This corridor would take you to the first-class aft grand staircase. The aft grand staircase was a near carbon copy of the forward grand staircase, however, it wasn't nearly as luxurious. The space featured a more circular dome, a smaller landing, less ornate woodwork, and most notably, only went down from A deck to C deck. On Britannic, the space would have received the same alterations as its more luxurious counterpart. There was also a major layout change on the B deck landing, which I'll get to later. Directly aft was the first-class smoking room. This was a similar space to the lounge, however, for men's use only. It features similar partition walls separating the sitting areas into different sections. The wood panels were mahogany, giving the space a darker atmosphere. The walls were fitted with mother-of-pearl stained glass art pieces. The floor was laid with linoleum tiles with a thin red and green pattern. The space was furnished with green square tables and green club leather chairs. Just like the lounge, the ceiling was raised. The centerpiece of the space was a fireplace, the only real one on board. Above said fireplace was the Plymouth Harbor painting, done by Norman Wilkinson. On Britannic, the smoking room would have received a major facelift. For one, the layout of the space would have been completely changed. According to deck plans, a rather large accumulative room was added on the starboard side, which took up what was originally another section of the smoking room. Besides this though, the partition walls would have been removed, creating a much more open area. On top of this, the stained glass art would have likewise been removed, making way for a much simpler appearance. The floor style was changed from a thin green and red pattern to a dotted black and white tile pattern. The ceiling was more ornate than what can be seen on her sister's, with more intricate plaster molding and larger, more modern light fixtures. The furnishings were mostly unchanged, however, their layout matched to the more open space. Looking aft from the smoking room to the right was yet another revolving door, through which was the portside veranda and palm court. This was a direct copy of the veranda opposite to it, on the starboard side. The two verandas were virtually identical in design, however, for separate crowds. The starboard side veranda was a non-smoking family space for women and children. Its portside counterpart, on the other hand, was directly connected to the smoking room, as it was intended primarily for men. The room provided first-class passengers with a calm, outdoor-themed environment, where simple refreshments such as tea and coffee could be enjoyed. Large windows throughout, as well as a large sliding glass door aft, helped in giving the room this feel. Ivy decorated the walls, and the space was furnished with wicker chairs and tables, surrounded by potted cantaya palms. The floor was made up of checkered, black, and cream-colored tiles. To my knowledge, the space's overall interior design wasn't heavily altered. The only two major changes were primarily in their layout. For one, the spaces were pushed back, which allowed for their bar and pantry to be enlarged and separated apart. Besides this though, the metaphorical walls separating the spaces were broken, and both rooms were connected to the smoking room. Its original configuration made sense on paper, however, simply caused the starboard side veranda to mostly be vacant by parents, becoming an unofficial children's playroom. This new configuration simply made more sense. Traversing down the aft grand staircase, we reached the space's B-deck lobby. On Olympic, it was a rather small lobby, however, on Titanic, the space was enlarged to accommodate a newly added reception room for the a la carte restaurant. a sort of hangout spot before serving time. On Britannic, the layout of this reception room would be completely changed. For starters, the space was moved from the B-deck aft grand staircase lobby to its own separate space aft on the starboard side of the ship. Wait a minute, you may be thinking to yourself, doesn't this newly added reception room take up space used for Café Parisienne? And you would be correct. As a matter of fact, Café Parisienne doesn't even appear in Britannic's deck plans. It's not completely certain why the decision was made to remove the space, but it was most likely done to allow for the expansion of the ever-popular a la carte restaurant. Anyway, this new restaurant reception room came with its benefits. For one, the location of the space allowed for direct access to the a la carte restaurant, as opposed to Titanic where you'd have to take a separate corridor. Likewise, the space was double the size, meaning that it could accommodate double the passengers. Not much is known about the furnishings and fittings of the space, but it probably would have been very similar to its bigger sibling down on D-deck, which I will get to in a bit. Aft of the restaurant reception room is the a la carte restaurant. Now, I've already gone into detail about this space before in my differences between Titanic and Olympic video, so to save me from repeating myself, I recommend you watch that video. One thing I didn't discuss in that video though were the restaurant's furnishings and fittings. The a la carte restaurant is one of the more unique spaces on the Olympic class. I can only describe the space's decor as an amalgamation of the first class lounge and dining saloon, creating something truly beautiful. The styling of the a la carte restaurant was Louis XVI. The most eye-catching feature of the space are the walnut panelings fitted throughout, with thick, diamond-shaped stripes of repeating dark and light tones of wood coloration. This paneling, as well as many other of the space's fittings, were trimmed in ornate brass gilt. This gilt was shaped into flower and ribbon motifs, similarly to the decorative motifs molded into the plaster ceiling. Mirrors imitating windows were installed into the aft and forward ends of the space, as well as inset into several oval cutouts. Along the center of the forward wall extended out a marble top buffet or counter. The space was furnished with circular tables that could serve up to 6 passengers, and smaller rectangular tables that could serve up to 2 passengers. The chairs themselves were made of French walnut, cushioned with plush and upholstered with Abusian tapestry patterns. The floor was that of pinkish Axminster carpeting. The a la carte restaurant was an incredibly popular space for first-class passengers, so much so that the design of the restaurant was enlarged for Titanic. By the time of Britannic's construction and eventual fitting out, the design had once again been enlarged, now extending out to both the port and starboard sides of the ship. Besides this though, this is one of the only public spaces on Britannic that doesn't seem to have been heavily altered. Based on official Harlan Wolff illustrations, the only change made to the a la carte restaurant was the removal of the decorative flower moldings in the plaster ceiling. Upon reaching the D-deck landing of the forward grand staircase, you would find yourself surrounded by the reception room of the main dining saloon. Combined, these two massive public spaces run a little bit less than a quarter the length of the Olympic class liners. The space was decorated with carved mahogany paneling, painted white in Jacobean style. Several beautiful stained glass windows were installed on both sides of the reception room that were naturally lit during the day by double portholes leading to the outside world. The space was furnished with sets of wicker chairs placed throughout the space, with the more luxurious green Chesterfield chairs placed along the walls. Directly forward of the grand staircase landing was a massive Abusian tapestry, and directly behind the grand staircase were 3 main elevators. The design of the reception room was different on all 3 of the Olympic class liners. Starting with the floor, Olympic's reception room floor was fitted with linoleum tiles, while Titanic's floor was fitted with Axminster carpeting. Britannic's reception room floor, on the other hand, would have been fitted with wood parquet flooring, with multiple large carpets placed under tables and chairs. While the layout of which differed, all 3 of the Olympic class liners featured 2 small vestibules in the forward corners of the reception room, which acted as an entryway for first-class passengers boarding the ship through the 2 main corridors on either side. Olympic's massive and overcomplicated layout, which attempted to connect the 2 main vestibules with a narrow corridor, inadvertently shrunk the area of the actual reception room, making its overall area the smallest in comparison to her sisters. Titanic's design was far more refined, removing the cumbersome corridor in favor of more space for a larger area aft of the main reception room. Britannic's layout would have called for a major reduction in the size of the 2 vestibules, with the newfound space being filled with tables and chairs. Besides these changes though, the overall appearance of Britannic's reception room would have remained unchanged. Through a set of doors directly aft on either side of the reception room, you would enter the first class dining saloon. By far the largest first-class public space, the dining saloon could seat up to 554 passengers, and tables seating between 2 and 12 passengers each, and green leather chairs. Just like the reception room, the dining saloon was fitted with white painted mahogany in Jacobean style, with an intricate strapwork ceiling. Pairs of between 2 and 3 rectangular stained glass panelings were fitted onto the walls, naturally lit during the day by double portholes. Interspersed along these windows were large plasters, with the head of Roman goddess Ceres, the goddess of architecture, and the Roman god Neptune, the god of the sea, topping them. The space was broken up into sections by 4 partition walls. However, they didn't take away from the openness of the massive space. The floor of the dining saloon was fitted with an elaborate pattern of red and yellow linoleum tiles. This is the one space on the Olympic class whose design wasn't altered on Britannic. There could have been minor changes made to the design, but none large enough for Harlan Wolff to make any sketches of the space. I searched for a very long time, and in the end, I could not for the life of me find any credible evidence that points to any major alterations to Britannic's dining saloon. Port of the E-deck grand staircase landing was a staircase leading down to a small room on F-deck. In this room was the entrance to the Turkish baths. These were a series of rooms for first-class passengers, where they could escape from the stresses of life of being a millionaire in the 1910s and simply relax, enjoying the hot, steamy air and warm bathing water, as well as the massages that come with the Turkish bath experience. The Olympic-class Turkish bathrooms featured a cooling room, a temperate room, a steam room, and a hot room. The crown jewel of these spaces was easily the cooling room. Decorated in a mix of Arabic and Moorish styles, the space was fitted with blue and green tiling on the walls representing plant patterns broken up with sections of carved teak decorating portholes and door frames. Ornate gilded half domes also decorated the door frames, giving the space even more of a Middle Eastern feel. The ceiling of the cooling room was decorated with gilded beams and lanterns, and was painted in a deep crimson color. The space was furnished with multiple folding chairs and lounges, all made from teak, as well as Damascus tables. The centerpiece of the space was a large marble drinking fountain. Britannic's configuration of the Turkish baths would have been virtually identical to Titanic's. However, the lavishness of the space would have been toned down a bit, as well as the case with most public spaces on Britannic. Just one corridor forward of the Turkish baths was a swimming bath. Measuring 420 feet in area and with a width of 7 feet, the Olympic-class swimming bath was one of the first of its kind on ocean liner, the first of which being the RMS Adriatic in 1906. On Olympic and Titanic, the decor of the room was rather basic for a first-class space, with exposed beams, pipes, and light fixtures. The pool itself was filled with heated salt water and could be accessed through a set of steps opposite to each other. 13 very basic changing cubicles as well as 2 shower stalls were placed along the inner wall of the space. While impressive for the time, these accommodations were very outdated by the time of Britannic's construction, and so the swimming bath would receive a complete facelift. The overall layout of the space would have remained the same, besides a small reduction in size caused by the addition of a double hole. The actual decor of the swimming bath was the focus point. Luxurious marble wall panels would have been fitted along every previously bare surface, likewise decorating the central columns along the length of the swimming bath. A moderately ornate arched ceiling was added with multiple glass dome light fixtures in the center. The porthole openings were slightly more elaborate, designed in a way which makes them appear as if they are breaking through the arched ceiling. Britannic's swimming bath globe is a perfect example of how Harlan Wolff took what worked on Olympic and Titanic and improved upon it for the ever-evolving culture and standards of the time. While by today's standards, many of the design changes made to Britannic may appear jarring, such as the steps back and lavishness of many public spaces, as well as the somewhat gimmicky and clunky gantry davits. For the time, these were welcome changes in an ever-changing and evolving market. And hey, there's still so much I didn't go over relating to first class, such as the upgrading cabin accommodations, but that just proves how many alterations were made to Britannic's design. This video, however, is just the beginning of a 3-part series going over the many design alterations made to Britannic. In part 2, I'll be going over the design changes made in relation to second class accommodations, so stick around, cause I have a lot to go over.